So in this lesson, we're going to look at why does the economy fluctuate. So this is all about understanding how that business model in which we see the rise and the fall of the economy across the trend line, that entire model is what we're going to really go into and understand and see exactly why that happens in this lesson and then the next lesson as well. So our business cycle. So an examination of the business cycle shows that economic activity fluctuates annually. So when we look at it, what we notice is the trend line. The trend line equals potential GDP, and that would be full employment of the labor force. And remember, full employment of the labor force does not mean every single person has a job because there's a natural rate of unemployment. But what you'll notice is that we see the economy annually is fluctuating around this trend line. So it goes above and below, above and below. But the overall progress of it is to trend upward. So the general trend is a rise in GDP with an increase in most years of real GDP. That's what our general trend has shown. On average, production has risen about 3% annually. Recessions do occur though. You can see the recessions there. This is an economic downturn. With recessions, what we see, of course, is that the economy falls below the potential GDP, or below the trend line. And that's where, of course, we see the number of unemployment. It goes up. This is where we start to see those negative economic indicators. So whenever recessions occur, there's a reduction in production. And of course, there's a reduction in real GDP because considering that real GDP simply measures production, therefore any sort of recession is going to negatively affect real GDP. So what we want to do is we want to use the 2008 to 2010 recession, look at that time period to kind of get a better idea of what's taking place within the economy, but also to give us a better idea of what that business model kind of looks like as actual numbers. So in the end of 2008, the U.S. economy enters into a recession. Of course, a recession is a period of declining real incomes and rising unemployment. Remember, whenever we use the term real, we're talking about inflation adjusted. So when we talk about real incomes, we're talking about purchasing power. What can we actually buy? So we see that real incomes are rising. Now, what that means in terms of a recession is if real incomes are increasing, then what that means is we can't buy as much because the actual income the difference between the real and the nominal is actually shrinking. So if real incomes are rising, then that means the gap between what you actually make and what you're really paid, the nominal, is smaller. So there's less for the employee. And then we also see there's rising unemployment. And so it's a contraction in the business cycle. So when we look at the business model, we see those recessions. So basically, what we know about the economy is it's going to peak eventually, and following that peak, it's going to enter into a decline. And it will fall all the way to the bottom of that trough, and then it will expand again. The key, of course, is that you want the expansion periods to be longer than the recession periods, or otherwise you're going to see an economy that gets pretty damaged. So when we look at this and we talk about real GDP per capita, now remember real GDP, so this is our productivity, per capita means we're dividing it by the population. So when we look at it there, we can notice that it fluctuates like we would expect it to do, but it also trends upward like we would see within the business model. So real GDP historically has trended upward, okay? And of course what we see that it fluctuates, and you can see some pretty large fluctuations, of course in the 1940s with World War II taking place. In the early 1980s, you'll see some downturns. In mid-1970s, the OPEC oil embargo was involved there. And then of course, and then you look there at that 2008, 2009. So let's look in detail at this 2000 to 2015 time period. So it gives us a little better vision of this 2008. So what you'll notice here is you can see that in 2000, we see that 2001, 2002, we see this gentle rise, and then the economy begins to expand. So from 2003 to 2008, right in through there, the early parts of 2008, you see that the economy is in an expansion, and it peaks, and then it drops. But you'll notice, of course, that drop, when you look at it from here, it doesn't look like much, but I mean, it's a pretty significant drop. And then coming out of the recession, the economy begins to rise again. So it's a pretty steady increase in real GDP But like we said, whenever we see those drops in it, those are those recessions that occur. And so, of course, in that 2008, 2009, early 2010, we see that economic recession taking place. So far we looked at real GDP. So let's look at the unemployment rate now. So when you look at the unemployment rate from that same time period, you get the idea, of course, with the fluctuations. So notice from 2000 to 2003, that's we see this increase in unemployment rates. And then, of course, we saw the expansion, and there it is. You can see that the economy was in an expansionary phase from 2003 to early 2008 by looking at the unemployment rate. So if you were to be asked, how can you determine which part of the business cycle the economy's in? One of the easy ways is look at the unemployment rate, because you'll notice there when the recession hit, you see the unemployment rate rises almost, up over 8, up into 9%, getting close to 10. And then, of course, it begins to go down again. And so when we look at these unemployment rates, what we're seeing, of course, is that the unemployment rate in real GDP, they're going to go the same way. If real GDP is rising, unemployment is falling, because you're going to see more people getting jobs. So they're going to work in that direction where we notice, whereas when real GDP is in decline, unemployment rates are increasing. So we can match those two up pretty well and see that when one goes one direction, one's going to go the other, and that's going to be pretty consistent. So the next thing we want to look at is during that exact same time period, let's look at the inflation rates. So what you're going to see here is that from 2000, 2001, 2002, notice that the inflation rate was smaller. In other words, we were not experiencing that much inflation. Prices, in fact, between 2000 and 2001 didn't rise all that much. But then you'll notice here when we see the expansion. Now, this is one of the interesting things. So 2003 to 2006, you'll notice prices we see peaking in 2005. That's the inflation rate. So about 3.4%, 3.4 point something percent. What we notice, of course, here is that inflation is increasing, and that's the interesting thing. Look at the amount per year, annual inflation rate. So 2005 was almost 3.5%. In other words, price levels increased annually almost 3.5%. That's pretty significant. And then you see what happens. 2007 drops, and then 2008 up over 3.5%. 2009 is a decline, though. So in other words, we can kind of look at this. Okay, so the economy peaks in 2008, and then towards the end of 2008, we see the business model into recession. Well, one of the ways to know that, prices actually fell. Now, you'll notice in 2000 to 2008, in every year, prices rose. They just rose in different amounts. In 2009, prices did not rise. Prices actually fell. Whenever prices are falling in the economy, we have deflation within the economy. You have to remember back to what that's causing. So deflation is a decrease in price levels. It's caused by money being removed from the economy. The reason why we see a decline in 2009 in prices is because people quit spending. So that's one of the keys here, is that unemployment rates rose. Why did unemployment rates rise? Well, they rose because people weren't spending. Well, real GDP fell. Well, why did real GDP fall? People weren't spending, companies weren't producing. Because they weren't producing, they fired their workers. So we can see how this all begins to tie together and relate. But that's 2009 year. Anytime you see that inflation goes below zero into a negative, that means that deflation is occurring within the economy. So then you'll notice they begin to rebound, going up and down. But this is one of the keys too, as you can tell, is that much like a lot of our other economic factors, inflation rates are increasing, but they're doing so at different levels. What we're looking for and what we're keying on is that 2009 year. That's what you really want to focus on, because that's the deflationary period. But all of these others, they're inflating. It's just at different rates at which prices are increasing. Okay, so these are two terms we see a lot: recession, which we've been talking about, and then depression, which really, if you think about it from an American historical standpoint, we've only really had one depression that's been defined as a depression. But there's a big difference between these two terms in terms of what they mean. But in terms of actually what's happening in the economy, you might be surprised. So a depression is a sustained, long-term downturn in economic activity. Unemployment rates are going to be high. Spending, of course, is going to be low, real GDP will be falling. That's what you would expect. Well, that's the exact same thing that happens in a recession, though. Here's the point, though. Economists, and particularly politicians, are hesitant to label a contraction in the business cycle, i.e. a recession, a depression. They're very, very hesitant. Why? Because of the Great Depression. But you would think 2 years of rising unemployment would qualify for being labeled a depression, and technically it does, because a depression is anything over 6 months. Recessions are that 6 months or so of economic downturn. Well, 2 years of economic downturn, that's a depression. But nobody wants to call it that, because the term depression, it brings back that 1930s and what was happening in the economy, and no one wants that to happen. So the only real depression within the American economy was the Great Depression. Everything else has been labeled either a panic or a recession. So during the Great Depression, unemployment rose as high as 25%. Middle class was essentially eliminated as their savings were lost in a banking crisis. Nobody wants to be reminded of that. It sparked widespread fear and panic about the country's collapse, and thus the government doesn't want to associate any sort of economic issues with an actual term of depression. Okay, it's really important to understand this. When you're talking about the business model, you're talking about two things. You're talking about long-term and short-term within the economy. The business cycle is the long-term. Hence, it's that flat trend line that's moving upward, which would suggest that in every year we would see a rise in inflation, our price levels, and a rise in production, real GDP. It's in the short run that we see the fluctuations up and down. So we're going to have to separate those out and look at them. And we'll start by looking at the short run fluctuations. So real GDP fluctuates around potential GDP, because unemployment fluctuates around the natural rate of unemployment. So you can basically think of it as unemployment as a line, and unemployment, the natural rate is this one line, and then unemployment is moving above and below that one line, and we've viewed that, we've looked at that already. That occurs because that unemployment rate, that natural rate, that is technically full employment within the economy. So whenever that line is at full employment, whenever the unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment are equal, whenever those two lines cross, we're at full employment. Well, that's the same thing with real GDP and potential GDP. Whenever real GDP and potential GDP cross each other, that point is that's when we see full employment and our potential GDP is being met. Now, we can obviously rise above potential GDP and we can fall below the natural rate of unemployment. Both of those, of course, are good things. But what the business model shows us is neither one of them can be sustained for a long period of time. Thus, the goal of economics and the goal from a political standpoint is to try to make those curves, make those fluctuations as flat as possible so that they mirror potential GDP, and that unemployment would mirror the natural rate of unemployment as closely as possible. So the fluctuations occur because of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, aggregate, the term here means total. So we're talking about total demand, total supply. So this is every market combined. So this, the model of aggregate demand and supply explains the short-run fluctuations in the economy around its long-term trend. And that's the key. When we talk about fluctuations, we're talking about short-term. Short-term aggregate supply does not mean the same thing as long-term aggregate supply. So you're going to see that. So when aggregate demand and aggregate supply are fluctuating, they do so around this long-term trend line. So the two primary variables used in the model of aggregate demand and supply are real GDP and overall price levels. So when you're looking at the graph, you'll notice that when you're looking at it, you'll see price levels are rising on one side, and that you'll notice down on the bottom when you're looking at quantity, you'll see real GDP growth and the quantity of production is increasing. And the trend line, of course, is going to move both of those up. And you can see it here. So the black line is the trend line. So that tells us that price levels will be increasing at a steady rate. Why? Well, one of the things we know about that is going to be the use of credit cards, bank accounts, loans, financial capital, which creates interest rates and thus generates more money in the economy. At the same time, when we look at the short run, we see that the peaks and the troughs and the expansions and the recessions take place. And our goal here is to make those curves as flat to the potential GDP as humanly possible. So we want to begin by looking at 3 facts about short-term fluctuations. So the first is that economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. In other words, economists cannot predict when a recession is going to take place. Now, it is very easy to look at numbers and to predict that one is coming, or that we are reaching a peak, or we are reaching a bottom. Those things can be determined. But to say that on such and such day and such month and such year that we're going to have one, no, we can't do that. Because they're irregular. Some will last for long months of time, some will ask for smaller amounts. In other words, you could have a 2-month recession and you could have 4 months of expansion, but then the very next month you could flip that. And you don't know exactly when they're going to hit their peak. So there's no way to predict when the business cycle is actually going to change. Now you just look for indicators. Economists are always looking for indicators of what is taking place. They cannot also predict how much it will change, because we're talking about the habits of producers and consumers here. So when we look at real GDP and we look at this over time, we'll notice, of course, the fluctuations. And you see huge fluctuations in the early 1940s during World War II. That's to be expected. You see those declines there in the mid to late 70s, then again in the early 90s, and then again, of course, in 2008, 2010. So we can look at this real GDP per capita. And remember, this is the amount of money each household on average. So the number of people living in America, you take that GDP and divide it by that number, and it gives you this real GDP per capita. So if we have a huge influx of population, will that have an impact on real GDP per capita? Yeah, it will. And so that could change this business model. And we can look here, and you'll notice on all of these areas that I've highlighted in yellow, these are areas that we see an economic downturn. So in other words, should we be in any way, shape, form, or surprised if the economy enters a down period at anytime soon? And the answer to that's no. I mean, you can just look at it. Now, what you will notice, of course, is the number of recessions has increased since 1971. And that's again, of course, with Nixon taking off the gold standard, increasing the amount of money supplied into the economy, because there was nothing that had to back the exact amount of dollars being produced. Rather, it was just the financial health. Now, of course, the other thing you'll notice is outside of those, the two in the 21st century, for the most part, they were much, much shorter than they were in the mid to early 1900s. So our second fact here is that most macroeconomic variables fluctuate together. Now, they may not move in the same direction. Some of them may be inverse and some of them may be converse, but they're going to fluctuate together. For example, when real GDP changes, unemployment's going to change. We've seen that already. And so economists can determine what kind of changes will occur based on this knowledge. If real GDP is rising, then economists can assume that the unemployment rate is going to be falling, and that's going to be the case. So we can look here at this real GDP. And so when there's a downturn in production, it's a given that unemployment will rise. You can look here. So you look at real GDP from 2008, 2009, 2010, you look at it on the same graph over here, and you'll notice unemployment rates rise when the economy enters a downturn. And deflation sets in. When prices fall, like in 2009, we saw prices fall. Look at the unemployment rate in 2009, how much it increases compared to other years. It began a very, very steep climb. Why? Because prices were falling, and therefore companies weren't able to sell goods, and thus they weren't producing. So fluctuations rise and fall in different levels. But one of the things we see is they tend to fluctuate at the same time, but they do so, of course, at different levels and also in different directions. That's why we bring this inflation up. So we look at 2009 across the board here. So 2009 with real GDP, we see that it is in decline. Unemployment is rising. Deflation is occurring within the market. So what does this all tell us? Well, it tells us people spent less money. People had less money because they had fewer jobs. Companies were laying off workers because they simply weren't selling their products. So we get this idea of being able to explain what's going on in the economy just by looking at the different graphs. Okay, so let's look at the third one. So I've got these two charts that we're going to be coming up here. So the third one is output falls, unemployment will rise. And this is one we've been talking about already. So with real GDP, whenever we see real GDP in decline, what we'll know is that the changes in real GDP are inversely related to changes in the unemployment rate. So they're both going to change, they're just going to go slow in different directions. So during times of recession, as in 2008, 2009, unemployment will rise. Well, we've looked at this already 3 times now, so we should get this. We can clearly see 2008 going into 2009, we see the downturn in GDP, and we see the rise in unemployment rates. So here we see this economic upturn, which tends to match this here, this kind of flowing. So notice the slight increase in real GDP, 2002 to 2008, and then it peaks. Same thing here, you'll notice looking at 2002 into 2008, the unemployment rates begin to fall. In other words, more people are gaining access to jobs. And then of course, we see this time period here as being here. So notice we have the steep rise in the unemployment rate, we have the steep fall in real GDP, and then as it begins to recover and level off, unemployment rates begin to recover and begin to go down. So we're able to match these two up to get an idea of what's taking place within our economy. So we continue on with answering our question, why does the economy fluctuate? Now, fluctuations in the economy are related to changes in supply and demand. These are not changes in the supply and demand of markets. So understand this, okay? When we talk about microeconomics, we're talking about each individual market. Macro is about the market as a whole. So macro is the accumulation of all markets into an overall market. Now, what that means, of course, is that prices in some markets could be falling while prices in other markets could be rising. Same thing with quantity. In some markets, quantity can be falling, and others it can be rising. So all of that combined together averages out to create this overall macroeconomic aggregate of supply and demand. So these are market changes as a whole. Now we use the term aggregate because that's the sum of, that's all. So aggregate demand is the sum of all demand for goods and services in the market. Aggregate output, i.e. supply, is the sum of all final goods and services produced in an economy during a given period of time. So the output is the supply. So what are we putting out? And then of course, what are consumers demanding? So aggregate output is equal to real GDP. So when we talk about supply, aggregate supply, when that term is used, we're talking about aggregate output or real GDP, because that's exactly what it is. Because remember, real GDP measures fluctuations. It kicks them out, and all it does is it says here is the productivity. Whereas nominal, we couldn't do that with, because nominal, of course, is current and still includes the inflation. So the aggregate price of aggregate output, the average price of aggregate output is the price level. So whatever that average goods, that's the price level. And then what we notice, of course, is that it's going to rise above and below what we figure that average price for goods is. It can be measured by CPI, it can be measured by deflator. Remember, both of those are used to measure inflation. Both of those are very good for determining price levels, of course. So this means that the aggregate demand is the quantity of goods and services households, firms, and the government want to buy at each price level. So now we're talking the whole economy here. So this is the aggregate demand. Notice what it looks like. Consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus next exports. In other words, aggregate demand is GDP. It's just the demand for it, what we're actually purchasing, those actual numbers. Okay, so let's look at this. This is aggregate demand. So it's a demand curve. We just call it AD as opposed to being D. So we're going to put a spot here. So at our first point here, A, we'll see that the price level is 120, and real GDP in trillions is about 8.8 trillion in aggregate output. So that's where we're at. That would be equilibrium essentially, but we'll get into a lot more of that later. But that right there is where we're looking at. Now, as price increases from point A to point C, what we see, of course, is the quantity of real GDP demanded decreases. So when we get to C, which is up here, notice what's happening, of course. As price levels increase, the real GDP demanded goes down. And that's the law of demand. It applies in markets and also, of course, within aggregate markets, which is the whole market, the same way. So moving from A to C, we see an increase in price levels causes us to have a decline in the demand for real GDP. So in other words, an increase in the level of prices reduces the quantity of aggregate output demanded. Now look at point B. So if we go from C to B, we see the increase. A to B, of course, would be a decrease. But we see how that works when you start leveling it out and you say, okay, what's taking place? If we are at C and price levels fall from C to B, well then our demand for real GDP for aggregate output for products will increase. So why do price levels have an inverse relationship with real GDP? So we've got three reasons why this occurs. So when we look, what we're asking ourselves is, why exactly do price levels increase, see here, causing a decrease in real GDP? So why does that occur? That's what we want to know. The first is called the wealth effect. Second is the interest rate effect. And then the third is the exchange rate effect. And so we'll look at each one of those, but each one of those is a reason why price levels and real GDP have an inverse relationship. So let's start with the wealth effect. So the wealth effect is based on the fact that when price levels go down, consumers feel wealthier and they spend more. The dollar has more value at that point, and their increased spending causes an increase in real GDP demanded. And so when price levels rise, the dollar is less valuable and consumers spend less because they feel less wealthy. So it's really easy to figure out. Basically, if you have a lot of wealth and your wealth is increased as a result of price levels, the question, of course, would be, did your wealth actually really increase? and this is what this is kind of talking about. It says, okay, when price levels go down, people feel wealthier because there's less money in the economy. Thus, that dollar is more valuable. As prices increase, though, the dollar loses some of its value because the money supply is increased. And as a result of that, because it loses less valuable, we don't feel as wealthy. Therefore, we'll buy less. So when you look at annual CPI rates, and we look here, we see that inflation, of course, is the increase in price levels. So CPI shows the increase in price levels. And then, of course, if you look at 1971 and onward, which we've done, we see that prices have been increasing quite significantly. Now, the question does that mean spending has slowed? And the answer to that, of course, is not necessarily. But at the same time, it hasn't increased all that much. So, and that's one of those things that we look at with why does that occur? Because of wealth effect. It's wealth in terms of how we value the dollar. So when we bring this up, we look at the historical trend, CPI and the deflator together. So the deflator is here, CPI is here. One of the things, of course, we had talked about was that CPI was rising faster than GDP. So CPI rising at a faster rate than the GDP deflator indicates that prices are rising faster than production levels. In other words, why is CPI higher than GDP? It's because of inflation. It's because of the increase in production levels that are very, very slow. Remember, GDP deflator is all about telling us about production levels. Well, they're increasing, but they're not increasing at as a faster rate as is prices. So that's what we're able to see. And so this would follow the concept of the wealth effect, because this shows us exactly how that effect is taking place. Okay, so our second effect is interest rate. So increased price levels cause real interest rates to increase. And this is due to the fact that as price levels rise, people spend less and hold more money. So price levels are rising, people are spending less money, they're putting more money into the bank. And this increases the demand for money, causes nominal interest rates to rise. Because people are saving and not spending, now all of a sudden we see people are demanding more money because more money is just not out there. So the nominal interest rate begins to rise. So we can look here at the nominal interest rate, and we can look at the real, and you'll notice, of course, the gaps in between them. Those gaps, of course, in 2010, that would be pretty much when we're looking at it from a base year, because you'll notice at that point, we see real interest rates actually go above nominal for a second. But that gap, that's what we're really kind of looking at. So in the short run, the inflation rate does not change. So in the short run, the inflation rate does not change. So when nominal interest rates rise, so does the real interest rate. So those two are rising together, rising and falling. With increased interest rate, investment declines. And that's the thing. If inflation rates are increasing, if inflation price levels are increasing, if the interest rates are increasing, then that means that not as much financial capital will be bought, which means, of course, that companies aren't going to produce as many goods. So when interest rates rise like this, what do we expect to also rise with it? Unemployment rates. And remember that one portion of GDP is entirely investment altogether. And so when firms reduce investment, the result is a decline in real GDP demanded. If they're not going to invest money, then they're not going to continue to try to produce at high levels, and thus they will begin to get rid of workers. So this is our gross domestic investment. So this is what happens. So you'll notice investment, of course, before 1971, we didn't see a huge amount of financial investment, financial capital. But you'll notice, of course, what happens beginning into the 80s, 90s, and then into the 21st century. Look how much investment has taken place, how much money has been invested. And that's where it begins to get interesting, because you look up there and you look at, like I said, into that 2008, 2009, and you'll notice investment fell significantly. So investment, like I said, this is a significant part of GDP because investment shows us expansions in production. Now, what we would like to see is, of course, is that trending upward with GDP, with the investment section of it, because if investments are increasing, and think about what's happening here, if we see a steady increase in the amount of money being invested, then one of the things we'll know is that if the financial capital being purchased, and then of course the number of jobs opening up is going to increase. Okay, so let's look at this exchange rate effect, the third one. So other things remaining equal, so we got to kick out every other factor and only focus on this one. When price levels change in the United States, it does not affect price levels in other countries. So if prices are rising in the US, that does not mean that prices are going to be rising in England or in France or anywhere else for that matter. So our price level increases, other things remaining equal, remember, don't affect price levels in other countries. So here's what this means. When price levels increase, American goods become more expensive. As a consumer, what would we do then? We'll buy less Americanly produced goods. So consumers purchase more foreign-made imports when price levels increase. American exports decline while imports increase. So we're buying more, importing more goods in, but we're exporting less because our goods just aren't worth as much. So GDP is only a measure of final goods and services produced within the country. So here's the issue. If price levels increase, Americans buy foreign-made products. They don't buy American-made goods. And the result, of course, is that GDP, being a final measure of goods and services, is only going to measure what we produce. Well, we're not going to produce that much because we're buying from other places. So this is why we see with this net exports, we see what's going to happen here, is that the increase in imports and decrease in exports affects GDP negatively, and the real GDP demanded declines. Why? Because imports are higher than exports. And we can look at that. So this is U.S. net exports. This is 47 to 2015. So one of the things you'll notice is that early on here in the 70s, I'm clicking this button, moving across, we aren't seeing huge increases. When you look at it, you'll notice now we start to see some, and you notice that since 1978, we've seen negative. So think about that. Since 1977, 1978, 79, the last part of the 70s, the United States has had a negative net export. In other words, we've imported more goods than we've exported since 1977, every year now. And then you'll notice this is where it gets huge. So minus 700 million. And we see these numbers. So moving across. So here's what this tells us. This tells us that in the United States, we import more goods from foreign countries than we export to other countries. And we know that, of course, because our economy is essentially a service-based economy in which only 20% of the population works as some sort of manufacturing job. And so because of that, we buy so many goods from overseas that that doesn't get counted into our GDP, and thus we see this negative. And one of the things with aggregate demand is it's very much like regular demand in the fact that prices cause changes in the quantity of demand, QD. Same thing here with aggregate demand, which means if it's not a price-related factor per se, it's not a change in price levels, then it's something else, then it's a determinant of aggregate demand and it causes a shift. So economic fluctuations in the business cycle, and this is important, are the result of the shifts in aggregate demand and supply. So what causes aggregate demand to move to the left or move to the right is really important to understand because that creates an economic fluctuation. Pretty easy though, that aggregate demand shifts as a result of changes in the components of GDP. So when consumption changes, investment, government purchases, net exports, when those change, we see a change in aggregate demand. So why do they change? That's the next question. So there's three primary factors that can cause a change in the components of GDP. So economic fluctuations are the result of shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand shifts as a result of a change in some part of GDP. So the question, of course, is what causes those things to change? The first is expectations. Second is fiscal and monetary policy. And then third is a world economic situation that we'll get, and we're going to look at each of these in detail. So when we look at these three things, what we see is that these three things will cause the components of GDP to change, thus shifting aggregate demand. So let's graph this and take a look. So there are three primary factors that can cause a change in the components of GDP. So we said these three right here: expectations, fiscal monetary policy, world economic situation. So here's aggregate demand. So we see the curve. Now, whenever it shifts to the left, whenever aggregate demand falls from here to here, from 81, we'll call 83, whenever that occurs, it's because of one of these factors, and we see this fall in aggregate demand. So when we look at point A and moving across, looking at point C, notice, of course, what happens is that the price level does not change, and that's the key here. Whenever aggregate demand shifts to the left or to the right, the price level itself remains the same. It's just demand that's actually shifting. So when we go to this direction, same thing, point B. Now we see that that price level stays the same, rather it's the aggregate demand that differs. And of course, this isn't something that we're going to jump into just massive detail. It's best for you to understand why those fluctuations are taking place, what they look like. So we can see right here what's happening. The real GDP changes, but the price level remains the same because it's shifting to the left and to the right. So we want to look at what these actually do. So the first of these is expectations. So when consumers have an expectation of increased future wealth, then an increase in consumption of goods increases. I'll give you a good example. If you were about to graduate from college and you had been offered a job making $100,000 a year, you would start planning out things you wanted to buy. Same principle. If you expect an increase in your wealth, then you will begin to increase the consumption of goods and services, creating an increase in the demand, aggregate demand. AD curve shifts to the right. If the expectation for the firm is increased profits, then investment would increase. So any sort of positive economic expectation that causes something in GDP to increase, we're going to see AD shifting to the right. So if, for example, that the expectation was that the gap between imports and exports was to fall, well, that would be good because that would help to increase aggregate demand, and it would shift out to the right. So if consumers expect an increase in inflation to occur, they will respond by spending now before price levels increase. So they're trying to catch it while price levels are still low, resulting in an increase in aggregate demand and thus a shift to the right with no change in price levels. So we see this constant shifting to the right, no change in price level, shifting to the left, no change in price level. So when you look back at this graph again, what you're seeing is the increase out to the right. So it goes from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. So what we're purchasing increased. The quantity is increasing, but it's not like price levels, because remember, when price levels increase, the decline is going to be negative in terms of our quantity demanded, our real GDP that we want. Okay, second factor, fiscal and monetary policy. So the second factor that creates a shift in aggregate demand is the fiscal and monetary policy that a government employs. So remember, government purchases is a part of GDP. So the decisions they make, good, bad, intelligent, unintelligent, they're going to affect us. Our fiscal and monetary policy, and we actually will do one entire unit looking exactly at that policy and the mindset of politicians. So changes in tax policies and transfer policies have an effect on aggregate demand. And they serve to increase or decrease the wealth of consumers. And this in turn, of course, affects our spending habits. I'll give you a good example. If the Obama administration said today we're going to give every family in America $1 million, would that have a significant effect on aggregate demand? Yes. I can tell you, for one, I'm paying off my house, and then I'm going to go and probably get a big new TV. But each person, now some people would quit their job, so we see how this is going to create some effects. So when taxes are decreased, consumers have higher wealth and thus increased spending. So this is, if you pay any attention at all, listen to all this different politics and stuff, and they talk about tax breaks and stuff. So whenever you hear the term tax break, the purpose of the tax break is to basically increase consumer wealth so that they will have more spending. So tax breaks serve to increase spending, whereas tax increases serve to decrease spending. So an increase in taxes thus decreases consumer wealth, reduces our spending. So tax increases aren't good because of the fact that they reduce the amount we spend. Firms don't want the government to increase taxes because they don't want to see a decrease in the amount of money being spent. Now, an increase in income transfers would increase spending among lower income levels, while decreasing transfers would reduce spending among lower incomes. So think about it like this. An in-kind transfer, and we've talked about this with the different welfare policies. So if you were to increase welfare, so you're increasing income transfers, it would increase spending among lower income levels. If you were to decrease welfare, then it would reduce spending among lower income levels. That's what they're saying. That's the idea here behind how this policy would work when you're talking about the government. So you'll notice over here, we've got our aggregate demand and our A point on our line, and then of course our line over here is going to be B, AD2. So when we look at that, whenever aggregate demand shifts out to the right, you'll notice the quantity, of course, is increasing. Well, the factors and things that will cause it to increase out to the right, decreasing taxes and increasing income transfers. Those two will cause that to occur. So if you were asked if you were asked something about it, how do taxes affect aggregate demand? Well, that's your answer. Increasing taxes decreases aggregate demand, shifts it to the left, while decreasing taxes will increase aggregate demand because increase in spending. And then of course with the income transfers is the inverse. If you want to increase aggregate demand, you have to increase the income transfers. Decreasing them will decrease the spending. Okay, so we said world economic situation. Our specific here is foreign exchange rates. So the global economic situation has the ability to create shifts in U.S. aggregate demand. Well, how? And the answer to that how is the foreign exchange rate. And it's the amount of foreign currency that you can buy with an American dollar. Whenever you go to different countries, you can exchange the American dollar and then receive that equivalent in another country's currency. You go to Mexico and one American dollar is worth a whole lot more than 1 peso. Go to Japan with a Japanese yen, go to England against the pound, and you give them $1 and you're going to get less than a pound back because they're not. In other words, the European Union, or in this case, in the English pound, is more valuable than the American dollar is. So when inflation occurs, price levels in the US rise. But other things remaining equal, they don't affect each other countries. So they're separate from each other. Now remember, of course, this is other things remain equal. There are factors involved here that can cause them to go the same direction. So the result is that U.S. inflation encourages a greater amount of trade. And it's true, if U.S. inflation increases, other countries are more than happy to send their goods here because we're going to buy them in larger amounts. American goods become more expensive. Consumers purchase more foreign-made goods, the imports. This, of course, leads to the American exports declining because they're not as valuable. You can't sell as much overseas. So how do we know this? Where's our proof? Well, we can look at one here. So here's prices. 1990 to 2012, what we notice, of course, is an increase in prices. The CPI level went up. Now look at net exports. Same time period. Pretty simple. What we can figure on real easily is when annual CPI is increasing, which is what it's doing, you'll notice what's happening to the overall amount of exports. It's in the negative. So even in 2008, 2009, we see a drop. And that's from consumers purchasing less goods. So we can look at this and we can say, okay, if inflation occurs within the American economy, we'll stop buying as many American goods, we'll start buying goods from other places. That's what this says. And we can prove it by looking at these factors here. Okay, let's turn and look at the other side here on aggregate supply. So the goal of the government is to get real GDP as close to potential GDP as possible. And that's what we were talking about. Remember, potential GDP is full employment. That's that black line that's going to be our trend line. And it's potential. That's when our economy is pushing is at its, not at its maximum, but at its most efficient. Now we can always go above that, of course. So potential GDP is the quantity of real GDP at full employment. And then real GDP fluctuates around the potential GDP. So in reality, what we're saying is potential GDP is that moment when everyone who is working in terms of full employment, remember, it doesn't mean zero unemployment, and then we're producing our maximum quantity of goods at that point. Now we can always go above that, of course. We can increase our efficiency, but it's not something that we're doing on a permanent basis. It's something that's done as an expansion, because you can't push and push and push like that, or eventually, of course, we know what's going to happen. It's going to decline. So we can see this in the business cycle model because the quantity of labor fluctuates around its full employment level. But I'm going to give you a different one that we've been looking at. This is a little more detailed. So when we look at it here, we look at a business cycle. You'll notice what's really easy to understand here. Anytime we're in the red, so when the business cycle falls below potential GDP, real GDP below potential GDP, that is when we see contraction within the economy. That's our recessionary time period. Our real GDP above potential GDP in the blue, that's our expansionary phase. The goal, of course, is to hit the black line. So in reality is you don't want the expansions, because you have the expansions because you end up having the recessions. That's why you end up with that. So if you could eliminate the recessions, you would be perfectly fine with eliminating the expansionary time period as well, because your potential GDP then would move right along with the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, important to understand here. This is going to get tricky for a second, as long as you get paying attention to the graphs, you'll be perfectly fine though. But long-term aggregate supply and short-term aggregate supply are different. So aggregate supply is the total supply of goods and services that firms in a national economy plan on selling during a specific period of time, i.e. aggregate output. So aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services that firms are willing to sell at a given price level. And of course, remember, as price levels fall, they're less willing. Short-term aggregate supply is different from that of long-term aggregate supply, though. In the long term, a country's economic growth, its real GDP, let's think about this. In the long term, a country's economic growth, its real GDP, depends on its supply, the factors of production. So over the long term, what we produce is dependent, of course, on our factors of production, plus the available technology to produce goods and services. So the supply, the factors of production determine the quantity of goods and services produced. Well, when we look at it, long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical and equals potential GDP. And here's the thing. In the business model, the trend line is long-term aggregate supply. So that's what you've got to remember. Long-run aggregate supply is the trend line. It's the potential GDP. So you'll see here when price levels increase, it has zero effect on the long-term aggregate supply. That's the natural rate of output. That's what the economy is going to produce at full employment. Price levels don't affect that in the long term. So when price levels rise in the overall economy, resource levels stay the same. And that's the thing, is if you look at the economy as a whole, if you take the entire American economy, if price levels across the entire American economy rise, resource levels are going to stay the same. Because all prices are rising, there is no change in the overall quantity of goods and services supplied. In other words, price levels rising in the long run don't change what we're going to produce. It's what's in the short run, however. That's what goes up and down. So long run aggregate supply equals potential GDP, equals the trend line that we see. So all prices are rising, and that's the key. If all the prices are rising, then there's not going to be a change in the quantity of goods and services supplied. It will remain exactly what it was, in this case, 6 trillion. So aggregate supply and aggregate demand, when we start to look at them, we're going to get into where we see the movement of towards and away from this line, from this aggregate supply. So now we know long run aggregate supply is that vertical line. That's the potential. So really what we want to look at then is short-term aggregate supply, because that actually does shift, and that's what we want to know, is why is that line shifting. So short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. When we look at it, this is what the short run aggregate supply looks like. This is what you would have expected. Price levels increasing, real GDP, of course, increasing because the incentive to create and earn more profit. So point A, of course, is the increase in price levels causes an increase in the output of goods and services. So as we move along the line, we see, of course, both price level and real GDP are increasing. From A to B, that's what we see. So you'll notice here, of course, when we say A, then we go to B, we see that increase. So we're used to seeing that. Now, decreases in the price levels cause decreases in the outputs of goods and services. They become less willing. So that's one of those things. This law of supply still holds true within short-term aggregate supply. So in the short run, changes in price levels do cause changes in real GDP. Now the question, of course, is why? Why is that? And there's 3 theories why aggregate supply slopes upward in the short term. One is sticky wage theory, one is sticky price theory, and the other is misperceptions. And so what we'll do is go through each one of those. You've heard of sticky price theory, and that'll help to kind of understand the difference between short-term and that long-term aggregate supply. So let's start with sticky wage theory. So sticky wage theory is the simplest explanation for why short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping. So the theory is based on the idea that nominal, remember this is the current wage, so this is what you would bring home on your paycheck, are slow to adjust in the short run to a change in price level. And that is very easy to make sense. So for example, if you have a job right now, if price levels change, are you automatically going to see your pay increase or decrease? It's not going to change in the immediate short term. And so to give you an example, we talk about this impact of time. So wages do not immediately adjust to the changes in the price level. I'll give you an example. If the union for any firm, any company signs a 5-year labor contract with that firm, regardless of the change in the price levels during that 5-year term, contracted wages are going to remain the same because that's the contract. As teachers, we sign a contract at the beginning of a year that this is going to be our pay. I don't care what happens in the economy, but my pay is not going to change during that length of that contract. Now, it may change at the end of that contract, but during that contract, it's not changing. They stick. That's this concept of sticky wage theory. So at the end of the contract, wages would then be renegotiated. So why is it important? What's the impact of sticky wages? Well, when price levels fall, nominal wages remain constant. So if the price level goes down, the amount you make, your current income, doesn't change. But now real inflation adjusted wages, they do change. They're going to rise. And that's important to understand because the employee wage loses value. So when price levels increase, we see one occurrence. When price levels fall, we see another. So when price levels fall, nominal wages remain constant. Real inflation wages rise. In other words, they get closer to each other. So the employee wage loses value. And the firm has to pay higher production costs as well because now that real wage that they're paying, that the production cost that they pay is increased. So fewer workers will be hired and the quantity of goods produced is reduced. Okay, our sticky price theory. So sticky price theory is the flip side of sticky wage theory. We've seen sticky price theory as the primary argument for Phillips curve. We've talked about it. Aggregate supply slopes upward because prices, the actual sticker price in this instance, are slow to adjust to changing price levels. So price levels increase, but the prices themselves, like when you go to the store to buy something, those don't exactly change overnight. So the cause of sticky prices is what we call the menu cost. So, and this is a literal term here, so these are literally the cost of printing new menus, catalogs, updating websites. In other words, what does it cost in terms of actual price plus time to go through and update the price of goods when prices rise? Even making new price tags, things like this, every so often you'll see people at Walmart walking through repricing things. Think about how many people that takes and how much time it takes and how much it's costing them to do so. So when we look further at menu cost, the time and expense of creating new prices creates lag. Not every firm is updating as quickly. For example, some firms are slower to adjust their prices than others. Simple fact here, can Amazon or Walmart update prices quicker? Well, Amazon can because they're doing it online. Walmart, of course, has literally got to go through and make changes. Walmart has to update the prices in their stores, online, and their marketing campaigns. So when price levels fall, lagging firms would have higher than desirable price levels. And this is one of the key things here. So we see if prices go down, then all of a sudden some firms that don't adjust quickly, their prices are higher than the rest of the economy, and so they're of course in trouble. And it causes a reduction in sales and leads to a firm's reduction in production. Okay, so our third theory here, misperceptions theory. It's based on the idea that changes in the overall price levels mislead suppliers about what is actually happening in their particular market. So what we're referring to is overall, which means economy-wide, so aggregate price level, compared to their actual market. So it would be like, for example, if we were talking about the market for, say, cell phones, if firms in producing those, and what happened to them, of course, is that the overall price level was maybe increasing, but in their actual market, maybe it wasn't, but because they saw the overall, it created a misperception of what was really taking place. So this is the overall level of the economy, and changes in price levels do not affect the quantity of goods and services produced in the market. So overall level of the economy, changes in price levels do not affect the quantity of goods and services produced in the market, because remember, the overall level of the economy is the long run aggregate supply. That's that vertical trend line. So each market, though, has its own fluctuations in price levels, and it's those market fluctuations that cause that business model to go up and down. So firms have confusion of what is actually taking place in the market, and you can see why. It causes changes in price levels to affect the quantity of goods and services produced. So if they're looking at an overall increase in price levels, but within their market itself, that's not occurring, they would potentially be changing the amount of goods and services that are being produced, even though they don't necessarily need to, or maybe they do need to, but then they don't. So to give you an example, kind of a thought process here, if the price level of some markets fall relative to others, then producers may reduce their outputs. And by relative, we mean it when you're looking at overall versus the individual. So the problem, though, is just because the price level of some markets falls, it does not mean the price level of all markets is falling. So regardless of the theory, of whichever the three of the theories you look at, changes in price levels affect the supply of the factors of production in the short run. And we see why. And shifts in short run aggregate supply, what we call SRAS, result from changes in natural resources, capital, labor, technology, and then expected price levels. In other words, when we look at aggregate demand being changes in GDP, aggregate supply changes, that shifts because of changes in the factors of production. Okay, so hopefully you may want to watch this twice. This is one of the more complex ones that we do in the entire course, is looking at this. What we've done is broken down, and we looked at aggregate demand, we looked at aggregate supply, we looked at why they shifted. Our next unit in our next lesson in this unit is going to go into detail and look at the actual equilibrium within macroeconomics and those fluctuations. So we see how it happens, but you get the idea of what causes shifts in supply, what causes shifts in aggregate demand, why there's a long run, why there's a short run in aggregate supply. So now that we do that, the next video will go in to see how those production levels rise and fall as aggregate demand or aggregate supply change. Okay, so let's just look last thing here, so give you an idea of what we were talking about. So here's that long run aggregate supply with potential GDP. So that's that line. And so that's the natural output within the economy at full employment. And so there's your short run aggregate supply curve. So you can see that as how they're different. Of course, remember, it's sloping upward based on the three theories we just talked about. And so whenever we look on this side of the potential GDP, so any point, basically in our next lesson, any point that falls on the left of long run aggregate supply is where real GDP is below potential GDP. And so you'll notice that anything to the left of aggregate, long run aggregate supply there is in the red on our chart here on our right. So when we look at the right on our line, we see the red there. That's real GDP below potential GDP, which that means that any intersection of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, I left demand off here on purpose because we're going to pick it all up with that next lesson, of course. But all points to the left of aggregate, long run aggregate supply are below potential GDP, which means that all points to the right are above potential GDP. So when we get into, in a second, looking at the macroeconomic equilibrium, understand that when we look at those points, everything on the right is expansion, everything on the left is contraction, and that'll help you keep up with what we're doing on it. So you can see that this long run aggregate supply, that is the potential GDP. So those two match up, which means that anytime we see intersections along that line, then that's where we're seeing, where we're meeting what our goal is. And remember that the goal of economic planning is to try to get the business model as close to that straight line as possible. So this is in our next lesson here. We'll look at the fluctuations of the business cycle as changes in equilibrium of aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply around that long run aggregate supply curve. That's what we're looking for.